Get started? Okay, today we're going to talk about the third of our four cognitive skills. We're going to be discussing perception. So just to remind you, four cognitive skills are attention, memory, perception, and cognitive flexibility. And perception is, in some sense, we've been working at one consistent level when we've been talking about attention and when we've been talking about memory. Now we're going to be talking about a slightly lower level process. And when I say lower level, I don't mean less important. I just mean happening before, in a sense. We're going to be talking about perception, how our perception shapes our interactions with music, art, the world, everything. When I talk about perception, it's important to clarify right up front that I'm not talking about just the senses. It's not, it's possible to, perception is really talking about the processes by which we're understanding the world. You can hear something without really understanding. You can see something without really understanding. So perception is in a sense both the combination of that sensation and the understanding that we bring to it. It's making sense of the world. There's a good William James quote about infants perceiving the world as a blooming, buzzing confusion. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to talk about how we go from that into this ordered, structured world that we perceive. And it's not really an easy task. I bring up this comic right over here because I'm talking about an app, the development of an app that will check whether they're in a national park, which is actually a very easy thing for a computer to do, and whether the photo is of a bird. That's something that is perfectly natural to any human, but would take an incredible amount of time and resources for a computer to figure out. These are things that we think of quite naturally as belonging to perception. Oh, that's a bird, now what do I want to do with it? But the very act of figuring out that that's a bird is a huge computational endeavor that people can do quite naturally. So it's that I'm talking about when I'm talking about perception. So how do we do this? Well, there's two important sources of routes that we can get information. And I'll be referring to these throughout the rest of the lecture. There's the bottom-up way, which is talking about information coming from the senses. You can see, this is a good example of seeing a brown cylinder and seeing a gray bent cylinder. Put those two pieces together and you have a coffee cup or a purple 3D rectangle, and that same thing, you have a briefcase now. So this is just taking information from the senses and putting it together to find the patterns there. However, there's also the top-down route, and this is talking about the influence of prior knowledge. So coming back to this picture that we showed you 3 weeks ago, now, assuming that you could see it before, now you can probably all see the image of the Dalmatian quite easily in there. You know that it's there, so you're bringing that knowledge to your perception. You're able to see that. I show a platypus here because it's a great example of something where you can know what all the parts are, and yet, when the first Westerners came and saw a platypus, they had no idea what it actually was or how to describe it. They couldn't make sense of it because even though they could see all of the different individual parts, they're all recognizable from other types of animals, the whole didn't make sense to them yet. So both processes are contributing to our perception. And to show you this from last week, I just bring this back up so I can show you this route right here. So in our sensory registers, we're getting information from our 5 senses, and we're getting the influence of pattern recognition or other top-down processes from our memory. So we're bringing both into it. So let's talk a little bit about some of these bottom-up processes first. So how might we actually recognize something in the world? One simple way that we could think about it is the concept of template matching. That is, if if what we see or what we hear matches exactly to something that we've already encountered, then it fits that template, just like a wax impression is something that is the metaphor the ancient Greeks used to use for this. But if it matches perfectly, then we know, oh, I've seen something that looks like that, that's a bird. This can work very well for things like barcodes or for things like digital numbers. And this is a very good way that we get computers to do this type of pattern recognition. But this type of conception has a few problems for real-world objects. Have you all ever had to do something on a computer or online and had to fill out one of those CAPTCHAs where you have to recognize the letters in some degraded thing? The reason they use that is because computers are terrible at that, but people can do it quite naturally. We can recognize the patterns and match it up, but if you try and use something like a template matching strategy, they don't match anything that we think looks like an A or like a B or like a 2. There's slight variations, so the computer has a hard time with it. We do it well. I think might have been one of you, but I know that somebody was telling me about a problem with different that children have with reading different fonts. Yeah, that was Cass, and she had talked about how it's good to use fonts with very typical typography because children will have a hard time recognizing things like A's that might look more like that or might look more like that. So using those types of difficult letters can actually make it more challenging from a bottom-up perspective because it doesn't match very well with what we've seen before. If you try to use a pure template matching strategy, the problems essentially are that you need to have a ton of different templates. You need to see all these objects in different slight variations, all from different angles. Imagine a template of a bird face on versus from the side versus with its wings open versus eating versus sleeping, versus from straight down. All of those have to, if you try to use something like that to match it with something you've seen before, you're going to run out of memory very, very quick trying matching that. So that template matching strategy is a nice one to start with. It's a very simple one, but we also use some more robust bottom-up strategies. And one of the basic types of strategies that we can think of has to do with prototypes. I'm sure you're all familiar with the word prototype, and it conjures up a certain image in your mind. What psychologists are talking about when they're talking about prototypes is essentially the most typical example of something. You can think of it as kind of an average of everything that you've seen before. And that every instance of a bird that you see, for example, might leave a trace on your memory. And so you have certain types of birds, which, like a robin, which might fit very well with all of your ideas about birds. It's small, it's got feathers, it flies, it sings, all of those things. Then you might see other things like a toucan, which are definitely bird-like, but maybe not as prototypical. They have a few deviations from how you might picture the typical bird. And then you could have things like a penguin or an ostrich, which are birds, but don't have very many of those qualities at all. So you can have, the point is that it's easier if you try to recognize things this way. You can recognize the more prototypical examples very easily. You can recognize the less prototypical examples with more and more difficulty. Now you can think about this in terms of let's say artistic representations. If I draw a very nice, well sketched out portrait of somebody, that would be very easy to recognize as a face. If I do something more Pablo Picasso-y, or getting into even more 20th century type of styles, it can become very, very difficult to tell what's being represented there. We can do it with training if we get enough examples, but because they don't fit as well with this prototype, this pattern of perception becomes more and more difficult to work with. Right? You can also picture same things in music. You have very characteristic examples of rondo form, or very characteristic examples of what an opera is supposed to be like. And then you can have deviations from that. You recognize them based on their similarities to the general instance, but the deviations are still make it a little bit more difficult to think about. Okay. So that's another type of process that we can use when we're perceiving things. Basically, we're talking about the similarity to a prototypical example. And that allows for a little bit of variation in there, more so than just a strict template matching.
That could be an object or an event, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. You could have these templates for, the idea of how children are supposed to treat each other in your class. That could be something you have an idea of, and when you perceive things that fall into that example, then you might perceive better or worse examples of that. So let's look at another type of bottom-up strategy, which is feature recognition. One fairly influential theory of perception posited that we recognize things by their combinations of features. This example actually posited 36 different basic geometrical shapes that we can warp and arrange in any different way. When we recognize those combinations of shapes, then we can recognize objects by that. So, for example, this one right here is one instance of this type of cylinder, another instance of the same type of cylinder but in a different stretch of it, and then an instance of this type of rectangle, and that becomes a flashlight. We see that combination of shapes, and putting together all of those features allows us to recognize what the object is supposed to be. Likewise with a coffee cup or a lamp or a briefcase, that type of recognition of the basic features can help us recognize visual objects. We can do the same thing with auditory objects as well. We can recognize the features of our mother's voice. We can recognize the features of a brass quartet, something like that. We can hear those, and when we put those features together, then we can recognize what the whole object is by the combination of their features.
So, Sean, is feature recognition then, for instance, the foundation of Lego blocks?
Well, so feature recognition is a very important part of doing accurate Lego building.
Right, accurate, yes.
Yeah. If you want to build something out of Legos, then that's one way to think about it. It's not the only way, but that's a very important skill in that.
Did you say there were 36 basic geometries?
Yeah, I mean, in this particular theory, it's not really important to know how many of there are or what the specific ones are. There's actually more advanced versions of this same type of theory that don't posit basic geometrical shapes, but posit things like combinations of corners and edges, things like that. And that allow us to talk about computer recognition of objects. If a computer wants to recognize pictures with doors in them, they might be recognizing certain types of shapes with certain types of color variations, things like that. So they're picking out the gross features in there. And these are things that we do automatically. I guess the most important thing from an educational perspective to point out is that the more experience that people have looking at different types of examples, not just the same type of example, but always different types of examples, allows us to get a better and more nuanced version of the prototype and its variations of anything. So having that type of repeated and varied exposure is important. And that applies to any of the artistic domains. And that applies to other things as well. That applies to learning vocabulary. That applies to learning mathematical concepts. It applies to learning geography. This is a basic taken to a little bit further extremes, but the same basic principle there. So let's look at how we identify particular features. We can talk about searching for features in an environment. One thing that has been shown very clearly and shown repeatedly, is that it's very easy to pick out single features when they contrast with the environment around. So if you look at these, look at this top one here and look for the vertical red line. You should be able to find it within a second. Now, at the bottom one, look for the vertical red line. You can find it, but it's definitely not as easy. This requires a more controlled search. You have to use your attention to do this. And this is because single features that are different from their environment will pop out at us, whereas conjunctions of features are more difficult. And they require attention. All right, so that's bottom-up perception. Now let's talk about top-down roles in perception. So our perception is also influenced by what we already know, or in some cases, what we think we already know. So if you look at, one of the easiest ways to see that is in reading. If you look at this sentence right here, if you're a native English speaker with reasonable facility, you should be able to read that without much difficulty. And that's because the sentence can provide the context, since the order of the words is not mixed up, and some of the letters, generally the first and last letters, are in the correct position. So we have enough context to build up a good representation of what should be there, even if it's not what's actually there.
And for me, I need to take that whole sentence into context, so I scan the whole sentence. But if I were a child and I was doing one word at a time and isolating one word at a time, I think it would be much more difficult.
Yes. Yeah, and if you put this one word at a time, it's actually much more difficult. If you just isolated each individual word and had people recognize them, it would be considerably more difficult of a task. This is also, by the way, what happened. Does anybody speak Hebrew at all? This is what happens in Hebrew, not the jumbling of letters, but in Hebrew, they actually don't have letters for vowels. It's only the consonant sounds that have letters when it's written out. So you'd see, so jumble, for example, would be just J-M-B-L-D, without any vowels in it. And so once you have enough, you pronounce the vowels, but once you have enough knowledge of Hebrew and how it works, you don't need the vowels to read. So going back to a child's perspective, what they actually do when they're teaching Hebrew to children is they'll have marks in there that indicate the vowels that they use for children to learn how to read and pronounce Hebrew. And then when they get old enough and familiar enough with Hebrew, they take those marks out because they're not part of Hebrew proper.
Well done.
So let's look at a couple of examples of some of how we bring context to our perception. So in this first one, you can see this is fairly easy to read here, but you'll notice that this and this letter are exactly the same. Even though they're exactly the same, because of their context around in the phrase and within each word, we know how to interpret them very easily. Likewise, you can do a very similar thing with perceiving spoken language as well. So if I play this example here.
The state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital city.
So I'll play that again, but this time I'll point out, listen to the word legislatures and listen to the S in the middle of that word.
The state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital city.
So the S is actually not in that sound at all. It was taken out completely and replaced by a cough. Even though it's not there, we have so much information about the context that we don't need it. And this is why speech perception is generally very easy. And furthermore, this is also why speech perception in a foreign language is generally very hard, because we don't have nearly enough background context. So I speak French reasonably well, but if you put me in a bar and try to listen to people speaking French, I'm lost. The background noise will just drown it out, and I can't understand anything. You take that same conversation and put it in a quiet environment, no problem. It's just because that all of that, the cumulative lack of context and missing tiny little bits adds up to a lot more when I'm working in a foreign language than I'm working in my native language. So we build up this context here. You can in that same experiment, they actually did things like taking out the sound. They had sentences like, it was found that the eel was on the, and then the last word was either axle, shoe, orange, or table. And so people would fill in that cough sound with whatever came afterwards, even though they didn't hear it, and even though it's completely ambiguous up to that last word, they go back and fill in what they heard with the correct sound. And most of the time they process that as if there weren't any problem at all in that sentence, even though it's technically ambiguous. And that happens to everybody every day when they're listening to English, or any other language, I suppose. You can see the same thing in reading. All of these words here are generally pretty legible, even though there's huge ink spots. And those ink spots could make them different words, but we have enough context of what are and aren't words to make them all legible. Now, picture doing the same thing with a child. They might not have enough background context to figure out what that word is supposed to be. So part of what we're doing in repeating all of this is giving them the repeated exposure and giving them the context to figure out how to interpret ambiguous things when they come about, because they inevitably do. Here's a good example in singing of our influence of prior experience and context.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible.
So, how many of you remember that sentence from before?
Yes.
And how many of you heard it as singing when she's saying that part? It's because you've heard it before. People who have not heard that before will interpret the sometimes behave so strangely part as speech. But once you've heard it as singing, you have that context and you can't get rid of it. I'm going to show one last example here, because I think this is a really good example in the visual arts. I believe this should speak for itself here. And so look at the picture here.
I'm a speed painter, and I'm going to do a painting in a minute and a half or less. Okay.
All right, here we go. Let's hear it for T West Street. All right, TM, 1 minute left. Here we go. Forty-five seconds, Steve. Here we go.
They can't figure out what it is.
All right, it's coming down to the wire. 15 seconds, Steve. Come on. Get up, Steve. Get up. 3, 2, 1. Let's hear it for T West Street.
So the point is, until you have that context of it being in the right proportion, you can't see it at all. You have no clue what it is.
Yeah.
You add that bit of knowledge and seeing it in its proper context, in this case the right orientation, it becomes clear as day. So that's another good example of this. And I want to show one other neat version of a musical version of this. This is, again, self-explanatory in a video, but it works pretty well.
You're going to hear a mysterious melody, a well-known tune where all of the notes are correct, but they've been scattered randomly across 3 different octaves.
Wow.
See if you can identify what these well-known tunes are before hearing the normal version. Here we go. It's quite tricky, isn't it? Here is an unscrambled version of the same melody.
Out of the drawer? Good for you.
And now, if we listen to the scrambled version again, it will be actually quite obvious what the tune is.
Yeah.
When I first came across this version, I was very, very keen to be able to identify the tunes before hearing the unscrambled version. So here's a second one for you to have a go at. And now for
Very
the
loud
unscrambled version.
Nope.
Once again, it's George who's done research into this auditory illusion. She draws an analogy with the brain's visual system, and when you first see this picture, it seems meaningless, just a lot of black blobs on a white background. But once I suggest what the picture is of, your brain will start to fill in the gaps and it will be able to recognise it for what it really is. Here's the moment of truth. The picture is of a Dalmatian dog on a dappled background. There should be some nose, and before you know it, the outline of the entire animal becomes clear to you. In a similar way, we can't recognise the mysterious melodies at first, but once we know what they are, we're able to follow along. Neat, eh?
So that's an example of how we apply our prior knowledge to our perception. Now, sometimes our knowledge of the world can lead us astray. So a good example of this is that we know from our dealings with the world that objects that are farther away generally look smaller. However, we also know that parallel lines look like they converge. So when we look at something like this, your brain can't help but seeing that the bottom line is smaller because it interprets that as necessarily being closer and thus in reality being smaller. Even if you know about this illusion, your brain still does that, still takes care of these processes. They're so automatic that it interprets that bottom line as smaller. It's applying our prior knowledge incorrectly. A good example of this, I really like this video because I actually went and built this thing. It's called an Ames room. Why is it? There we go.
Lights, camera, perception.
It's awesome.
When you were little and some big kids pushed you around, did you ever fantasize about becoming bigger all of a sudden? Well, I did. And now I can. At the Exploratorium, San Francisco's Science Museum. How did I do it? The easy way. By manipulating your perception. When you first saw me, I appeared to be normal size because you couldn't see the rest of the room. But as the lights came up and the camera pulled back, your brain performed a new instantaneous analysis. It now saw me as small. It added up all the visual information it had about my size and the size and shape of the room. And then it added in everything it knew from experience about the usual shape of rooms, that they're rectangular and have right angles. So So when I walked over here, your brain was convinced I was growing incredibly large because there was no other perceptual explanation, even though it wasn't logical. Let's look at it again, only this time from a different perspective. The room is not rectangular at all. It's totally distorted. There are no right angles anywhere. So that makes this clock, which is large and oval, look the same as that clock, which is small and circular, from your other perspective. The floor slopes upward. As you can see, the ceiling slopes downward. So I'm not getting larger at all. You're just misperceiving my size because you think that you're the same distance from me when I'm over here as you are from me when I'm over there. But in fact, I'm twice as far away.
So that's an illusion known as the Ames room. And so this type of illusion is used to great effect in a lot of cinematography, for example, and other types of productions, just by forcing a particular perspective and playing around with sizes and distances, you can make certain things seem larger or smaller than they actually are. Another thing that can be influenced by that can influence us is by context. Is color. Our color perception is highly influenceable. So if I were to tell you that this dot right here, this square and this square are exactly the same color, and the dots inside of them are exactly the same, it seems hard to believe. But if I take away all of the other context, you can see. I'm going to go back and forth a couple of times so you can see. I'm not changing anything, just removing the rest of it. So seeing the white background and seeing that part of it seems to be like it's in shadow tricks your brain into thinking that they're different colors right there. We're highly influenceable by our context. These types of influences can also occur across modes, like from vision to hearing, to touch, other types of things. And this is the type of thing that can cause illusions of puppeteers, make it actually seem like a puppet's talking, because it lines up. If it's a good puppeteer, it lines up with what they're doing. Also, if you've ever noticed, your sound, especially if you have one of those big screen TVs or if you go to a movie, the sound doesn't come from the middle of the screen. We perceive it to come from the middle of the screen because that's where we're looking and that's where the action takes place. But the sound actually comes from off on the sides. We don't hear it that way, though. One of the best examples of this is the McGurk effect. So this is an effect that looks at how we hear sounds. So first, let's watch this video. So everyone paying attention? It's important to watch this because it's very brief. So a bit weird, but what sound did people hear? Did you hear da? Yeah. Now, I'm going to play this again and close your eyes. Okay? Everyone closed. It's very clearly a ba. What they did actually is they had two different things. One from when he was speaking a ga, and one from when he was and then the sound from when he was speaking a ba. When you put those together, the shape of his mouth influences the way you hear it, and makes it sound like it's in the middle, like it's a da sound.
I heard a ga.
Can you do it again?
Yeah,
I heard a ga.
too.
If you hear a ga, then it's working even stronger. So
Yeah, I still hear that. Oh, but now I heard ba because I looked away.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you look away, you'll hear ba. If you look at it, you'll generally hear da. Some people will hear ga. That's the shape his mouth is actually making. But the sound is a ba. So highly influenceable. Okay, so I'll come into the final section here where I'll talk about the theory of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology was founded by a bunch of Germans in the 1920s, but their argument was that the whole that we perceive is greater than the sum of its parts. So you can see this, for example, in bistable figures, where the same image can lead to two different stable perceptions. The argument being, if the same thing can lead to two different perceptions, then we're obviously contributing something more just beyond what we're seeing. So a good example of this is the Necker cube, which you probably have seen before. You can see it with this face out, or you can see it with this face out. And you could probably switch it yourself if you try. This is another good example. So have people seen this one before? What do you see?
A duck.
A duck. Do you see a bunny?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Okay.
there he is. Yes.
Mhm.
See them.
And you can switch back and forth whenever you want. Same thing with this one. What do you see right here?
Fish.
Fish. But if you look on the side,
Face.
Yeah.
Archimboldo was one of the artists that
Oh, yeah?
dog constructs.
yeah.
Where's my face?
See the
If you-
winky eye.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, look at here.
Yeah. So it can be either. What we're contributing our knowledge to the picture. Now, Gestalt psychology is mainly known for their principles of grouping. So this is the general patterns by which we think about images, by which we put them together. And there are 6 principles here. They're proximity, similarity, closure, good continuation, common fate, and good form. I'm going to get to all these, each in turn. Proximity is just the idea that we group items together based on closeness, all other things being equal. So here, we see it as 1 unit. Here, we see those same 6 dots as 3 units of 2 lines there, because of how close they are to each other. Similarity. We group items together based on how similar they are. Again, this leads to a different perceptual pattern from another combination of 6 by 6 dots. Closure is the idea that we group items together so that they form closed figures, with all else being equal. So this one, even though it's not a circle, we see it as a circle. Even though this one is not a rectangle, we see it as a rectangle because we implicitly perceive it as being representative of a closed form. Good continuation is another one. We group items together so that they form smooth or continuous lines. So we see this as one curvy line and one straight line, and not a line that goes like that and a line that goes like that, even though it could be. We also group together items that are moving in the same way, with all other things being equal. So it's easy to see if you look at a traffic pattern. You can see groups emerging based on how things are moving. Groups of very angry people, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
That's Chicago. Might as well be Toronto.
Trump doesn't move that fast.
I know.
Yes.
Was anybody stuck on the subway today? No?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Not fun. Not fun.
Yeah. The station's kind of
It's still closed. Still.
I think it's open
Oh, is
again.
it now?
crazy. I thought they opened it, yeah.
Yeah, around 3 o'clock or something.
I was worried. I assumed I had it going to me.
And then finally, we tend to group things together based on how we've seen it before and what the thing means. So this is why we see a Dalmatian in a picture like this, because we have an idea of what the meaning of this picture should be. So pattern recognition arises from all of these processes. It arises as a result of bottom-up information, which we can process through templates, through components of images, and through features. It also arises through our top-down influences, which are the result of prior knowledge and some of these natural organizational principles. So when we talk about pattern recognition, we're not talking about just mathematical patterns. We're talking about our ability to see an order in the world, in a way of organizing our perceptions. So those can be mathematical patterns like red, blue, green, but they can also be the patterns that we use to make sense of the world. Like that's a face. That's these are types of things that go together. So it's when we're talking about this type of perception, we're really talking about how we're organizing our perception. And when we break this type of organization, that's what we call an oddball. That's perceiving a difference, something that breaks that pattern.
How do you call it? How do you call it?
An oddball. So we can talk about oddball tasks, where we present something similar over and over and over again, something that follows a pattern, and then when we add something deviant to that, it breaks our organization of something, either based on what's come before or what we implicitly know to be as part of there, and we perceive that as an oddball. So a good example is hearing a wrong note in music. You know, if I'm singing "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday dear Angela, happy birthday to you," you hear that because
Grade 7.
that is it breaks our pattern. It breaks our organizational principles that we're bringing to that song.
And won't that increase attention?
Oh, that definitely increases attention. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the interesting thing is there's actually a lot of neuroscience research that shows that even if we're not paying attention, our brain is still processing those oddballs, and we're still doing that. So this is happening, it tends to direct our attention towards it, but it's happening even before attention, you know? It's why we would, and the same type of thing would happen if I talk about, like if I said, this group of girls go to the party. You hear that, and it breaks our patterns of our set of expectations of what types of words should follow there. And it elicits our attention, but our processing of it happens even before any attention is allocated there.
Sean, I've just
So-
noticed the time.
Yep.
Is there anyone who is desperate to get to the
So,
we're 5 to 8?
In fact, that's my last slide there.
Oh,
So,
perfect timing then. So if any,
so
we
we'll
could
leave it
have-
off there.
we could have some questions afterwards, but if anyone wants to get to the cafe, you should do it right now because they close at 8.
Oh, that's
Yeah. Yes, that's, sorry, that's the, I know that.